What's up everyone, welcome to our tutorial on installing PureCSS. At this point we understand what this library is, so let's work on incorporating it into an HTML file. We'll divide this into three subtopics. The first will be creating a practice.html file. This one we'll use just to demonstrate the PureCSS concepts, and we'll also create another file in the next tutorial that will be used for the actual project code. The next topic will be to set up the HTML file for basic web page development. That means just adding the HTML tags and headers and all that good stuff. And then finally, we'll add the PureCSS headers themselves to get access to the library. And that'll be it. So let's head on over to a text editor of our choice, because of course we need a way to write HTML code. Okay, so I've got Visual Studio Code open here. This will be my personal text editor of choice. I really like this one because it comes with just about all of the components that I need to begin writing HTML and CSS code. Also, it helps to organize my project files really well. You don't have to use Visual Studio Code, but I'd recommend you use this or something very, very similar. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll start with a new file. You can do that by clicking on here or opening up a new file up at the top there. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and save this as, actually first I want to create a folder for all the stuff, so I'm just going to open up Finder, and on my desktop I'm going to create a new folder, PureCSS. Okay, cool, so this is on my desktop. Again, doesn't matter too much where we save it as long as you're aware. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and save this as, this will be practice.html. It doesn't matter what you call this one as long as it has the .html extension, and I'm going to put that in that folder I just created. Okay, there we go. Good stuff. You should see that because we saved it under the .html extension, it is an HTML file, and that's basically it for creating the file. Okay, so step one complete. The next thing we want to do is add some necessary tags and stuff. So we're going to open up the doc type. Okay, make sure it's HTML. We're going to open up the main HTML tag. Okay, and then within this, we're going to open up our head tag, and our body tag. Cool. Okay, good stuff. So this is the basic HTML page setup. It's classic. You need this in pretty much any HTML file. Now, for the future tutorials, we're going to be adding some custom CSS styling as well as using the pre-styled elements. So feel free to link a separate CSS file if you like. But we're not going to bother with all that. We'll actually just put all of our styling within a style tag. Oops, a style tag like this. Okay, but likely the practice.html won't really contain much styling, so we can leave it out for now. Okay, cool. So that's step number 2 complete. We have our file already set up for HTML development. The final thing that we want to do is add in some headers. Now, rather than manually typing out the code, because it's actually quite tedious, what we can do is head on over to the browser. Okay, so navigate back to the PureCSS.io website if you navigated away, and what we're going to do is we're actually just going to take this here. You can also find this code in Get Started. Okay, and we're just going to copy that right into our head tag. Now, unfortunately, I personally found when I tried to run things as is, it wouldn't work. So I think if we get rid of the integrity component and the cross-origin component or fields, so we go ahead and save that, then we should have access to the PureCSS website, or rather PureCSS framework, and we should be good to go from there. Now, the other thing that I want to add in, and I'd recommend you do as well, just to not run into any issues later on, is to add in the viewport meta element. Okay, so this is better for controlling, as it says, the width and scale of the viewport on mobile browsers, because we want everything to be responsive, especially once we start using responsive grids. We should include this as well. So let's go back to the web page. We'll copy this, go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're just going to paste it in there as well. And by the way, go ahead and give this a save after every time. I'm just pressing Command S. For Windows, that's Control S. Otherwise, you can just go to File Save. Okay, cool. So back to the browser. There's one final thing I want to do, and that's going to be to copy some actual pure CSS code. This will just make sure that we actually have the library incorporated. If we see styling like this, then we know it's good to go. Otherwise, we will have run into some issues. So let's go back to, this is under the Get Started page. We're just going to copy this code here, pure G, with some units. I'll explain what all this is in the next section. Don't worry. For now, let's just copy this. And we're going to go into body. We're going to paste this. Okay, we're going to give this a save. Make sure that you save it. Okay, and then we'll open this file up in a browser to see if this is indeed incorporated properly. So let's go back to Finder. Go to where you saved this file. You can see practice.html here. And I'm just going to double click to open it up. For me, it defaults to opening up in a browser. Okay, so this looks really good. I think that we have successfully incorporated PureCSS into our file. If we hadn't, then essentially this would look very different. In fact, I'll show you guys what it looks like if we don't have any PureCSS. So just comment that out. Okay, this is what it will look like with no PureCSS. As soon as we have the PureCSS, this is what it should look like. So we're good to go. Congratulations on incorporating PureCSS into your web page. In the next sections, we're going to get to know the grid structure a little more, and this code will start to make a bit more sense. But for now, feel free to try to play around with some other stuff. Once you're ready to learn some more about the grids, move to the next section. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys shortly. Hello everyone, and welcome to our tutorial series on grids. Over the next few tutorials, we're going to explore aspects of pure CSS grids, starting with basic grids, then responsive grids, and then implement some grids in our code. So we'll divide this into 4 subtopics. The first will be to explore the grid documentation, and then to implement a basic grid in our code. These 2 we'll cover in this tutorial. The next tutorial will focus on the resizable grid structure. And then in the third tutorial, we're going to start our actual project code up and implement some grids within that. So let's start by exploring the grid documentation in a browser now. Alright, so here we go in the PureCSS webpage. This is the welcome page. We're going to go into the grids section here, and we'll focus on this. So we're not going to go over everything now, and actually over the next few tutorials we'll still not cover absolutely everything in here, so we'll leave some of the exploring up to you, but at least we'll get the basics down. So grids are used to structure our pages in PureCSS. Everything PureCSS related goes within these grids. Now we can use grids to build row and column structures based on the items within the grids. Within the grids, the items we use are units or pure U classes. Okay, so we have a grid that's kind of the outer container, and within the grid we have these unit classes which are pure U, pure G is for the grid. Okay, and we use these pure U units to build up the row column structure. Okay, the size of the grid is really dependent on the units within it. Now we can use just basic units that will take up a default width, or we can specify a proportion of the parent width that we want a unit to take up. These widths are fractions, okay, and we can think about these as percentages. So for example, if we wanted a container that takes up half the width of the parent, we would do a 1-2, because it's essentially saying 1 out of 2 or 50%. Okay. On the other hand, if we wanted one that the other example here is 20%, so a fifth of the parent, it's 1 out of 5, or 20%. This will only take up a fifth of the parent container. Now, by default, everything is placed in a single row, but that is really based on how much width the entire row takes up. Once we start having overflow, or once we start getting width that is greater than the width of the container, we get overflow onto the next row, and so that's how you have kind of this row column structure. Now these units themselves aren't really anything special, they're just there to build the structure of the grid. All of the actual content goes inside of these units. Okay, so the grid is the overall outer container, the units are the inner container that specify the structure of the grid, and then all of the content goes within these units. Okay, so this is actually the code example that we've copied into our project. We'll turn to this in just a second. There's one more thing I really want to go over here in the documentation first, and that is the sizing system. So like I said, the width of our units is based on a fraction of the parent. We can have it take up 100% by saying 1, 1, 1, 5, 5, or 1, 1, 1, 24, 24. So the width is based out of either 5 or out of 24. Okay, so that means that let's say we wanted something that takes up 50%. We could do 12 out of 24, so that's equal to 50%. We could do 1 out of 2, that's also 50%. Same with if we wanted something that takes up 100% of the width, we could do 1, 1, 1, 5, 5, or 24, 24. They're all going to be the same, okay? Because it's a fraction out of either 24 or a fraction out of either 5, okay? So using either fifths or 24ths, we can pretty much build any size of container we want. As for the height, that's only as big as the content within it, okay? So it can have a height of 0 if there's no content, but it will actually still take up the entire width. Okay, so I know I did a whole lot of talking there and not too much demonstration. So let's head on over to the code and we'll take a look at some examples and see how they play out. Okay, so actually, yeah, let's turn to the code first. Okay, so if you remember, we copied and pasted this code into our body here. That's the same code that you'd find here on the grids page, or I think also on the get started page. So you can see that we have a div. The class is pure-g, which means that this is a grid. Okay, as soon as you assign the class of pure-g, we're dealing with a grid. We have some units within this grid. Okay, so you can see that these are 3 divs. We've assigned the class pure-u. That means it's a unit, and we've actually given them an explicit width. Okay, in this case, each of these units is taking up a third of the parent width. Okay, so regardless of how big or small the parent is, these are forced to take up always exactly a third. It's a little like saying a width equal to 33%. Now, we don't have to explicitly give these width percentages or width fractions, but it just kind of makes sense to us because if we do want these to each take up a third, obviously we want to specify that. Right now, this is kind of what our code looks like. If we save this and refresh the page, you can see that each of these is indeed taking up a third. Okay, and that's because, again, we specified that they also have a bit of content within them. If you really want to see how big they are, you can add some styling. So, for example, add maybe like an ID to each of these. Okay, and then add some style elements to get some color or something in there, just so you can see exactly how big they are, but this should be fine for now. Okay, so we've got each of these take up a third, and they have a little bit of height. The height probably ends somewhere around here because the height is really based on the content. Interestingly enough, know that if we had no content inside of here, okay, but we're still giving it a width, it will still take up that width, but we'll have a height of 0, okay, because there's really no content in there. So this is extremely useful if we wanted, for example, something taking up a third here, something taking up a third here, and nothing in between. Okay, we can still get that spacing by using essentially blank or empty containers. Okay, so this is nice that they're all take up 100%, but what if we had something that wasn't quite 100%? Let's say this is a third, this is a half, okay, and then this is a third again. So altogether, this row takes up more than 100% of the width of the parent. Well, in that case, we actually get this overflow effect. So this takes up a third still, this takes up a half still, but that means there's actually only 1/6 of the space left. Okay, so for that, it's not quite enough for a third, so that actually overflows onto the next row. Okay, and in this way, we get this nice multiple rows and multiple columns effect. All right, we can never have more than 100% of the width. So let's go back to third width. The last thing that I really want to demonstrate here is the fact that these will always take up a third of the width of our grid. So that means regardless of how small I make this, okay, this is kind of the smallest I can make the browser, these are always going to take up exactly a third. Okay, so that's really, really nice. Again, it's very similar to doing width equal to 33%. All right, so I think that's actually pretty much it for now. What I want to do is introduce you to the basics of grids, the fact that they take up only as much height as the content, but we can specify the width. You can also leave it just as the default width if you'd like, but generally speaking, we do want to specify a width. Know that we structure our pages with grids, we build up the grid structure with these units, and our content goes within these units. What I'd recommend you do is play around with sizing. Again, remember that the size sizes are fractions of 24 or out of 5. Keep that in mind and perhaps try to build up some interesting row column structures, see how those respond to resizing. In the next section, we're going to focus on responsive grids, which will add some extra spice into our pages. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one. What's up everyone? Welcome to the second tutorial in our grids tutorial series. Previously, we covered a basic intro into grids by taking a look at the documentation and then implementing a basic grid with 1/3 width units. Now we're going to expand upon that by taking a look at resizable, or as they're known as responsive grids, and we'll follow the similar format, first turning to the documentation, then looking at some code examples. So let's go on over to the documentation and get started. Okay, so we're back on the grids page. Again, that's just on the PureCSS.io website, and then going down to grids here. We're going to scroll all the way down to the stuff, because we've already covered it, to the pure responsive grids. Okay, so let's talk about how pure responsive grids are different from regular grids, because at the end of the day, they're really there to again provide a row and column structure. Well, the big difference is that the grids that we have used so far have kind of like a fixed width proportion. That means that these pure U 1/3 are always going to take up 1/3 of the parent width, regardless of how big or small the screen is. However, sometimes we want to resize and reposition elements based on different screen sizes. Typically, you won't have the exact same layout on mobile, for example, as you do on desktop, just because the screens are much smaller and there's different proportions, and if you kept the exact same layouts, your website or your web pages would be really, really small on mobile. So you want to be able to adjust. Now, in the past, what you would have had to do is use these app media queries and specify at this width, we want to have these things take up this size or be in this position. At this other width, then we want things to take up a different size, different position, etc. However, that's actually a really inconvenient way of doing things, because that means you have to repeat a lot of code, and it's just incredibly tedious. What PureCSS has allowed us to do is take advantage of these classes here that allow us to specify different width proportions at different screen sizes. So for example, at the extra large screen size, this means when the screen is greater than or equal to 1280 pixels, it could take on a certain width, whereas if the screen size is only large or medium or small, it gives you the pixels here, we want perhaps slightly different layouts. Let's take a look at the example they've given here. This means that at small screen sizes, it's going to take up 100% of the width, because we have pure U1. Each of these will take up 100% of the width. However, as soon as the screen size grows to a medium size, either by manual resizing like this, or by viewing it on a different screen, maybe a tablet versus a phone, so that brings it up to a medium size, each one is actually only going to take up 1/3. Which makes sense. I mean, we have a small screen size, so 100% of the width might be kind of equivalent to 1/3 of the width on a bigger screen size. Okay, so the syntax of specifying the proportion of width is basically exactly the same as if you were just to use a regular grid. The difference is that we specify the screen size at which the proportion should take effect. Okay, so there's this nice chart here. You can check that out. Other than that, there's actually not too much more in the documentation that we want to go over. You can check this other stuff out if you'd like, but it's kind of not within the scope of this course. Okay, so again, I've talked a lot at you without giving you much in the way of examples, so let's head on over to the code and take a look at an example of this in action. Okay, so let's open up Visual Studio Code. Cool, so this is where we left off last time. We have just a regular grid units that are each taking up 1/3. Okay, so if we go to our web page, refresh it, this is what it looks like. That means that even when the screen is very small, these are still taking up 1/3. Perhaps, however, what we want is to, when the screen is very small, we want these to take up 100% of the width, so we have thirds, thirds, and thirds like this. And then when it's big, we want them to take up 1/3. Okay, that way we're kind of making maximum use of the screen while things are still reasonably sized. So for that, we want to be able to employ a resizable grid and then specify certain widths that these are not going to take up 1/3, they're going to take up 100%. Now, before we can use resizable grids, we actually need to link the resizable grid style sheet by going back to the browser, going up to here, and we're just going to copy and paste this line of code. Okay, so the resizable grids are actually not included in the base package of PureCSS, just because they can kind of interfere with media queries. So if you really want to do your own custom media queries, don't use resizable grids because this overrides those. Okay. Otherwise, if you want kind of the default resizable behavior without having to manually do the media queries, use these. Okay, cool. So we have our basic grid. I'm actually just going to copy this and paste it below. So if we refresh this, I just want to show you what it looks like for now. Okay, that's fine. Regular resizable or non-resizable grid. So what we want here is when the screen is small, we want this to take up 100% of the width. So the best way of doing that is actually to say we want this to be a pure U1. So when the screens are small, 100% of the width, but perhaps when the screen is large size, let's say medium perhaps, then we can take up 1/3 of the width. Okay, so we're going to add another class. It's going to be pure U medium, or MD for short, 1,3. Okay, so this means once the screen is as big or bigger than a medium size, which is, according to the chart, greater than or equal to 768 pixels, it's going to take up 1/3. Okay, so I'm just going to paste that for each of these. And so we'll go ahead and refresh the page. So no change, makes sense because this is a big screen size. This is extra large, I believe, at this point. But look what happens when I shrink it down to smaller than a medium. So right away you can see that shift there, it jumps down below because this is just the border right here of the medium screen size. This is smaller than medium right now, and then as soon as it gets to medium or bigger, then it takes up 1/3 each. Okay, so we can expand upon these and really make them jump around. For example, maybe at a very small size, I want it to take up 1. Okay, once it reaches a small size, so we'll do pure U. Now we'll do small. Maybe I want this to take up 1/2. At medium, 1/3. At large, I want it to take up, so it's U large. I want this to take up 1/4. And at very large, extra large, I want it to take up 1/5. So we do pure U extra large 1-5. Okay. Just for convenience sake, I'm just going to copy and paste this into each of these. Yeah, let's just copy that and paste it here and here. By the way, these don't all have to be the same. I'm really just doing this for demonstration sake so you can kind of more easily see the effects. Okay, but in this case, it's going to be 100% of the width at very, very small. Once it's small, only 50%, 33% at medium, 25% at large, and 20% at extra large. Okay, so give this a save. Let's go back to here and we'll refresh this. Okay, so we have, actually I'll copy and paste 2 more. That way we have 5 and can really demonstrate it. Okay, so this is extra large. At large, you can see they're only taking up 1/4 because this is shifted onto the next line. Okay, at medium, they're taking up 1/3. At small, they're taking up 1/2. And anything smaller than that, they're taking up the 100%. Okay, so I personally think that's really, really cool because, again, it makes building the screens for mobile, maybe for something in between like a tablet, and then for desktop all in one go, super, super easy without having to repeat a ton of annoying code in the media queries. All right, so that's pretty much all we want to cover here. Again, these are the, 5 screen sizes, although these are the 4 specifications. Anything smaller than that is just the default there. Definitely play around with this until you're kind of comfortable with these 5 different screen sizes. Alternatively, if you want to view these on, let's say, a mobile device, you can go into the developer tools by clicking on here, more tools, developer tools, and that way you can click on here. And then you can select a different kind of a device. So this is what it will look like on an iPhone 6, 7, or 8. This is what it will look like on a Galaxy Fold, on an iPad Pro. And that way you can kind of look at different things. Responsive allows you to kind of manually resize things. And when you're ready to go back to normal, you just click on the X there. Okay, so that's it. In the next section, we are going to be opening up a new project and implementing some grids towards building up that final web page I showed you guys at the beginning. So stay tuned, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. What is up, everyone? Welcome to the third tutorial in our grids tutorial series. Over the previous two tutorials, we introduced grids by exploring the documentation, implementing basic grids, and then implementing a resizable grid. Now we're going to put all of that together in our actual project code. So it means we'll have to start the project file up, get it set up, and implement some basic grids that will comprise the project structure. Okay, so let's head on over to the code and get started. Okay, so this is where we left off last time. We'd implemented a basic grid and a responsive grid. Now, this is just a practice code file. We'll want a separate file for our actual project code. So let's create one now. We're going to get a new file going. I'm going to go ahead and save this as, maybe we'll save it as index.html, the classic syntax. It can go in the same folder as practice.html, there's no problem, just because we're going to be using the single file again. Okay, cool stuff. Now to save some time, I'm actually just going to copy and paste all this code over. So just select it all. That's a Command A, Command C, and a Command V if you're on Mac, or you can do Control A, Control C, and Control V on Windows. Alternatively, you can just go to File, Copy, Paste, etc. Okay, actually I think that might be under Edit. Yes. Okay, cool stuff. So we'll keep the headers in here because we still want the basic style sheet as well as the responsive grid style sheet and the meta. But let's get rid of this because we'll be kind of implementing a project structure from scratch. Okay, so our project here is actually going to comprise of two grids. Just going back to the web page for reference, we're going to have the header up at the top here, and then we're going to have the main body on the bottom. Okay, so there's going to be a grid for the header and a grid for the body. So let's get started with that. We can get a div class is equal to pure G. Okay, so this will comprise our header, and actually we may as well assign the ID now. So we'll do ID equal to header. Okay, and then we're going to do another grid for the body, and we can just call this something like main. Now within our header, we're going to have actually just two items. One is going to be a drop-down menu kind of in the top left here, and then we're going to have a title in the middle. Now what we would really like is if on a big, medium, and perhaps even small web page, we're going to have the drop-down here, and then the menu here. Okay, so drop down is going to take probably about a quarter. Not the menu, the title is going to take up about a half, and that way it's going to be centered, and we're just going to have a little space for the drop down. It really doesn't need much room. However, when we get to extra small screen sizes, what we want is the drop downs take up the entire width, and then the title to take up the entire width. Otherwise, we get it being cut off. It doesn't look very good. Now for that, we can do that easily with responsive grids. Essentially, all we need is a unit. In our header, we can ignore main for now. All we need is a grid unit. So div class is going to be equal to pure U. We want a unit that's going to take up 100% of the width of very small sizes. This is the drop down again. But as soon as we reach perhaps even a small screen size, that should be enough space that we have this take up a quarter of the space. So pure U small 1 4. Okay, so 100% when the screen is very small, and only a quarter when the screen is small. Okay. You might be thinking that a quarter is still not going to be enough room. It actually is plenty of room. The small screen size is really not that small, so this should be fine for our sakes and purposes. Okay. For now, we can have some kind of filler content. I'm just going to put drop down in here, just so that we have something to demonstrate there. Because again, it's not going to take up any height if we don't have any content in there. Okay, so the second item that we want is going to be another div. It's going to be another pure U1 because it's very small screen sizes. We want this to take up the entire width again. However, once it's small, we know that this is a quarter. We want this to take up a half of the available space, so 1 and 2. And this is going to be our title. We can call this, you know what, actually, let's go ahead and fill this with some content. This one is going to contain a drop-down menu, which is why I'm just kind of adding some placeholder text there. But this one is actually going to contain our title, which we can fill in right away. I'm going to put this in a heading tag, and this is just going to be called something like Zenva messaging. Okay, so let's quickly recap what we did here before we see the working example. So we have our first grid. It's got the ID of header, and within that we have 2 grid units. The first is going to take up 100% of the width of very small screen sizes and only a quarter of the width once the screen size is small or bigger. It just has some filler placeholder text. We're going to get rid of that later. The second unit is going to take up again 100% of the width when the screen is very small, but it will only take up a half of the width when the screen is small or larger. That way we have kind of the text in the center, and we have another quarter worth of space on the right hand side, which we won't be using in this tutorial series. We just put a heading in there with Zenva messaging. You can put paragraph if you want, it doesn't really matter too much. Okay, so let's save this. We'll go on over to here, and let's take a quick look at what this will look like. So we'll go ahead and, oh, that's actually practice.html. What we want is the index.html. Okay, so this is what it looks like for now. I know this is kind of right in the top left corner, doesn't look great, but don't worry, we will fix that. But as soon as this goes to a very small screen size, you can see that this is shifted over. Okay, so good stuff. We're definitely getting that resizing effect. Now, of course, we'll need to add in some styling to make sure that this doesn't look too bad. But rather than doing that right now, let's build up the rest of the page structure, and then we can add on all that styling and stuff later on. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to add in the main, the structure of our main grid here. So this will actually be fairly straightforward. All we essentially need are 3 columns. We want to have one for kind of like a list of all the chats. We want to have one in the middle that is going to contain our current chat with all the messages and a little form. And the final column on the right is just going to be kind of like an other tools column. It will contain a little calendar and some buttons to allow for user selection. Okay, however, that is how we want things to look on a desktop size. On mobile, obviously, we're going to be shifting things around. We'll probably stack them one on top of the other, just because there really isn't going to be much room to place them all side by side on a very small screen. Okay, so we can start by creating our classes, our div classes. These are all going to be pure units. So let's just leave them at pure U for now. Okay, and we'll add some filler content. Again, this is just going to be temporary. I'm just going to say column 1. Okay, and actually I might as well give this the ID right now. Col1. Let's say column 1 text, just so that we have a bit more space. Okay, I'm just going to copy and paste. This one will have the ID of col2 and col3. It's column 1, column 2 text, and column 3 text. Now I want this one to take up 100% of the width of very small screen sizes. Once we reach small screen sizes, I want this to only take up a third, and then at the large screen sizes and beyond, I want only a quarter. So I would do a pure U small, 1 third, pure U large, and above, I want 1 quarter. On the other hand, so this is again my chats menu. On the other hand, I want this one to take up 100% of the width at very small screen sizes. At small screen sizes, so pure U small, I want this to take up 2/3, okay? And a pure U extra large, I want this to take up a half. Finally, I'm going to go to my third column, and I'm going to have this take up 100% of the width at very small, and I'm only going to have it adjust when the screen size is extra large, because that will ensure that we have enough room to bring this tool option up to the right hand side. Okay, so let's give this a save, and we'll just take a look at what these changes will look like. So you have column 1, column 2, and column 3. Again, 1 quarter, 1 half, and then a quarter. You can see them start to shift and resize once we hit smaller and smaller screen sizes. Now, there's not a whole lot to see here right now, but don't worry, we'll add some styling in the next section, and then you'll really be able to see the screen resizing take effect and see the cool changes that occur. Okay, so stay tuned for part 2 of this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next one. What is up, everyone, and welcome to the 4th tutorial in our grids tutorial series. Over the previous 3 tutorials, we introduced the basic grids by first exploring the documentation, take a look at some basic grid examples, then moved on to something a bit more complex with the resizable grid. In the previous section, we just started our project and built up the main structure of the page, comprised of a couple of grids. Now all we're going to do here is add some styling so we can get some color onto the page, kind of start to move things about a little bit and go from there. So let's head on over to the code and get started. Okay, so this is where we left off last time. We had built our basic body up, comprised of 2 grids. So one grid for the header, that was just a title and what will later be the drop-down menu, but just has some text for now. And the second part is going to be the main part of the page that contains the 3 columns. So let's just quickly go over these columns because I think there should be a correction. I put large there. This actually should be extra large. Basically, these are going to, each of the columns, take up the entire width and extra small screens. On small screen sizes, we're going to shift this to take 1/3 and this to do 2/3. So we'll have the 2 columns side by side. This one will actually remain on the bottom because we don't have a small specification there. Once the screen reaches extra large sizes, however, we're going to shift this to take 1/4, 1/2, and 1/4. And I guess you could do large sizes here, but I just put extra large for convenience. Okay, so that is pretty much it. Doesn't really have much content for now, but we'll change that in a little bit. What we are aiming to do here is add some styling into the page. We're just going to add again some color, probably add a border to the header. We're going to add some color and height and stuff to these divs as well. So rather than create a separate CSS file, I'm actually going to add the styling right in here. It's really personal preference as to what you want to do. I figure it just makes things easier if we have just the one file with everything. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is set the HTML and the body height to be equal to 100%. This will allow us to set % heights in the other elements later on. Okay, so next up we want to work with the header because we should do top to bottom in our CSS files. We're going to set the header because we have the ID that we assigned here. We're going to set a background color. We'll do teal. I figured it makes for a nice color there. We're going to center any text within it because if you remember when we go to run our page, in fact, let's take a quick look. We just set the color, but this is all the way over to the left-hand side. We want that text centered. So we're just going to set the text line equal to center. Okay, and I'm going to add a small border. So we'll do border bottom only. Okay, we'll set equal to solid, 1 pixel, and we're going to say it's equal to black. Okay, so let's give this a save and refresh. You can see that this is centered now. This is centered and there is a thin border, just differentiating the header from the rest of the body. Cool stuff. So looking better already. Now let's work on sizing and coloring the rest of the elements. So our main div here is going to contain the others. I want to set this height equal to 90%. That way it forces the rest of the content to fill the rest of the page. So I'm going to access main. Again, we set the ID here. So I'm just going to take main and I'm going to set the height equal to 90%. I figure it gives us a pretty good height there. All right, so probably not going to see much change right away, but let's go ahead and add some color to my column 1 and column 3. Column 2 I'm actually going to leave as plain white, but we'll probably add a kind of like a height restraint there. Okay, so I should have IDs assigned to each of these. So I'm going to do col1. Okay, we're going to set the maximum height equal to 100%. So remember that this is not 100% of the entire screen height. This is 100% of the parent, which is 90% of the screen height. So it's going to take up the maximum height of 100%. Okay. That means if the content isn't filled, then we won't necessarily have it take up the entire height. Okay. I'm also going to set a background color here. background color. I think orange should be fine. Okay, next up we have col 2. Okay, all we'll do for now is set the maximum height, okay, to 100% again, and that's all for now. No color or anything else. We don't really have much in the way of other elements inside of it to style anyway, so we'll leave it as is. Okay, last but not least, we're going to set column 3. So we'll say col 3. We're actually not going to set the maximum height for this one, and I'll explain why in just a second, but we will, however, set the background color. I found aquamarine gives a pretty nice color there. Okay, so why didn't we set the background, or the maximum height for column 3? Well, the way our app is going to work for mobile, and actually let's give this a save and we'll just refresh this. You can see the colors take effect, but the height hasn't taken effect just because we don't have any content. We set the maximum height, remember. Okay, so essentially we get this kind of structure once we're dealing with very small screen sizes. That means that our column 1 text is going to be on top, followed by column 2, and then column 3 is right at the bottom. Now, column 1 and 2, I want to both fill the entire page because these are going to potentially have quite a lot of members inside of them. This one's going to be a specific conversation, and this will be the list of all conversations, so very likely there'll be lots of elements in there if we were to build an actual web page. Column 3, however, is just kind of tools, and there's not necessarily any guarantee that those tools will fill up the entire height. I want column 1 to fill the entire screen height-wise, column 2 to fill the entire screen height-wise, but then column 3 is at the very bottom, so there's kind of no need to take up 100% of the height. So that's just why I personally have chosen to do things this way. Feel free to adjust the heights as you see fit. But I think that is actually pretty much all we wanted to do here. Again, giving this a save and going back to Chrome. If you want to see what this looks like on a mobile setting, you can go once more into the developer tools and then check things out that way. So for example, if I want to see what it looks like on an iPhone 5, which is pretty small, it's like this, although you can do that with the responsive screen resizing. Cool, all right. In the next section, we're going to talk about menus, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next part.